This is Jay Smith here. I want to talk about what I consider one of the geniuses of Odon Lafontaine. You've just been watching his video, and you have seen the amazing depth and breadth that he brings to this whole discussion on the origins. And it's been terrific looking at your comments at the bottom. You are commenting just that, and you're saying this is probably one of the best ones he's done. One thing about Odon, he's able to talk about almost any subject that has to do with Islam, and certainly that has to do with history. 12 years have got him to where he is today. And he's enjoying finally talking to an English crowd. And this has been great to listen to his French style of English and how he pronounces word. I know a few of you have questioned that, but let him go. I think this is, listen, when we speak French, we desecrate the language. He does not desecrate English. I think it's brilliant what the way he usually, even the words he chooses. Now, in the last episode that we did, where we looked at the peoples and the many different characters and groups that are pivotal to how Islam actually was created, we went off on a side for about 11 minutes, 10 or 11 minutes, concerning the sources of the Qur'an. It didn't really fit in that episode, so I took it out, and I want to introduce it here, showing you just the depth and breadth that Odon has. So listen to this as we really look at the Quran, because this is his area that he loves to talk about more than anything else, looking at the Quran and trying to delve and find out what happened historically. He then wanted to go back to where the Quran got its material from. It's called source criticism. And so we're just doing a little discussion, he and I, back and forth on source criticism. Here it is. See what you think, and then I'll come and end it off at the end.
Those coverers were Jews who covered their sacred scriptures with other scriptures, and they claimed that those other scriptures were divine. And this describes the Talmuds. In the 7th century, it was the beginning of the widespread of the Talmud, particularly the Babylonian Talmud, among the Jews. And some other Jews, namely the Quranic Nazarene, did not agree with the Talmud. They thought it was sort of an abomination, a sacrilege, because people invented a text and they put it over the Bible, over the sacred scriptures. They covered the sacred scriptures with the Talmud, and they changed, because of this, they changed the meaning of the sacred scriptures, and they hid some prophecies, they hid some stories in the sacred scriptures, and I think those stories relate to the coming of Jesus, the prophecy about the Messiah, and this is what the coverers are accused of in the Quranic text by the preachers.
Let me just interject here real quickly. Looking at the Quran, I'm going to read chapter 2, verse 78 and 79 while you take a drink. And it says here, it says exactly what you're saying. And there are among them, the Jews, unlettered people who know not the book, but they trust upon false desires, and they but guess. So these are people, the book, the scriptures, they don't know the scriptures, they trust upon their own desires, they guess. Then woe to those who write the book with their own hands and then say this is from Allah, to purchase with it a little price. Woe to them for what their hands have written, and woe to them for what they earn. So there's an exact example of what you're saying in the Quran. It's actually talking about these coverers. It's referring to these very people. And of course, what would they have written that is not the book? That would be the Targums, the Mishnahs. These are the Apocryphal writings that you find all the way through the Quran. Almost all the stories.
Exactly.
The stories about certainly the different biblical prophets. The story of Abraham in Surah 21, that comes from one of these coverers. That comes from the Mishnah of Rabbah, the one in chapter 5, verse 31, the story of Cain and Abel. Now, there's a good example of the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah. The very next verse, verse 32, comes from the Mishnah of Sanhedrin, which was written in the 5th century. And the story in chapter 27, Solomon and the Queen of Sheba and the hoopoe bird, you know that story? Brilliant story, exciting story. But that story in chapter 27, verse 17 to 44, comes from the second Targum of Esther. These are all the coverers who have written with their own hands. They but guess, they don't know the book, and then they're calling it the book. And that's what these coverers are doing. What's fascinating is that the Quran makes the same mistakes by taking those stories and incorporating into their own text.
What we find in the Talmuds, I think there are two types of Talmudic writings. We find ancient Jewish tradition, which might have already been there at the time of Jesus, for example. And we also find post-Christian inventions.
Yeah.
And I think this ancient Jewish tradition, it's like with a tree. You have the trunk, which is the Jewish tradition, and several branches. One branch is the Talmudic Judaism. Another branch would be the Nazarene Judaism. And so this is why we can find in the Quran stories that really, really resemble the Talmud. For example, the very well-known quote of the Quran, when you kill one man, it's like you have killed the whole of the humanity. We also find it in the Talmud.
Yeah.
I think no one, they did not copy each other for this one, for example. It comes from ancient Jewish tradition, which went one way in the Talmud and another way in the Quran, thanks to the preachers who were Nazarene Jews. And so this is also to address many of the many comments that were made under our videos about the Talmud, or about the Quran being a mere copy of the Talmud.
All I'm saying, be careful, because even the example you gave of chapter 5, verse 32, which is he who takes the blood of one is he who takes the blood of all. That one follows verse 31, which is the story of Cain and Abel, and has been found in the Bar Sanhedrin, written in the 5th century. When in the earlier copy of the original, you will find that redemption analysis on the blood of Abel is actually written in the margin by a scribe, which was then copied as the text to follow the story of Cain and Abel and the killing of Cain. Of Abel by Cain, and that the redemption analysis was nothing more than a scribal thinking through of the ramifications of the blood of Abel. Now that was in the 5th century, so that comes long after the Bible. That's 5th century AD, not BC. So that comes just before the Quran is put together, and that's known as the Bar Sanhedrin, written in the 5th century. So these you can play them through. We know who wrote it, we know when it was written, we know why it was written, and we even know where it was written. And it's fascinating that it's these stories that incorporate themselves into the Quran. But when you look at chapter 2, verse 79 that I quoted earlier, that one is fascinating, because that one is shutting down this idea that, and it's actually warning the readers of the Quran, be careful of these very stories that are in the Quran. So when and where that was put in there, it's fascinating, because it's a contradiction in terms of the very thing that the Quran incorporates. It's a good argument also to use when Muslims claim that we have corrupted our Bible, and say, well, what about these verses? What about these stories? And
exactly,
where do you think they came from? And it's good to have this historical perspective to know where.
This is what Guillaume D is working on. I've already spoken about him. He's a French scholar who teaches in Belgium, who is a very top-notch scholar on Quranic studies. And for example, he found that many passages of the Quran, many stories of the Quran, are direct copies or translation from ancient Jewish tradition. For example, the story of the creation of Adam is taken from a Jewish story from the 2nd century, the story of Adam and Eve, and it's kind of cut and paste into the Quran, and it's fascinating. It's really amazing to find the sources, some sources of the Quran. And we see a lot of Jewish sources, sources from Jewish apocryphs, such as, for example, the Book of Jubilees. We find many interesting stuff in the Quran and also in the Standard Islamic Narrative that were taken from the Jewish tradition that was also expressed in the Book of Jubilees. For example, the Tawaf, the fact that Abraham turned in a circle 7 times around the altar in Jerusalem. This is taken from the Book of Jubilees. You do not find this in the Bible. It's in the Book of Jubilees. And you find this also in the Islamic tradition. This is why the Muslims, when they perform the Hajj in Mecca, turn 7 times around the Kaaba. They imitate, they don't know it, but they imitate the Jewish tradition of Abraham, as it is written in the Book of Jubilees.
Yeah. Fascinating. I mean, this is terrific stuff, and maybe we should do a whole series. We did this with Paul. I don't know if you know Paul from London. He did through and found, he didn't know about the Book of Jubilees, but he did find the circumambulation 7 times going counterclockwise. And he noticed that this is something that the Jews did. And of course, if that is the case, then almost all of their traditions have been borrowed from pre-Islamic times, looking way back to Jerusalem itself. One of the things that one person that probably stands out, in 1910, there was a book written on the sources of the Quran by St. Clair Tisdale. For those of you who want an English edition on this material, you can go to that book. It's out of print. You can get it on PDF. Just Google it. The Sources of the Quran by St. Clair Tisdale, Tisdall. And just look at all the stories that Odon is talking about. Do you have it there?
But nowadays, we keep on finding new material, sources over sources and more sources. In France, there has been a publication of this. It's a very big book, 3 volumes, the Qur'an des historiens, the historians' Qur'an, in which was directed by Guillaume D and another French scholar. And here we have lots of sources in the Jewish tradition, but also in the Syriac tradition, in the Christian Syriac tradition. Many apocalyptical stories that we find in the Quran are in fact copies of homilies from Syriac priests, such as James of Sarug, or apocalyptical stories from the Syriac tradition. It's amazing. We almost have a sort of scheme. You see, the Quran is a sort of patchwork. Pieces have been sewn together, and we can find now the origin of those pieces.
It might be good, Odon, if you and I just go through some of those sources. We don't have those in English that you have there, and it might be good for the English audience to hear these and realize the wealth of research that you've done there in France. You and Guillaume Dye, especially his works. If you could maybe introduce us to his works, because we would not know him here in United States and Europe, or in the rest of the English-speaking world. And
we shall do that. We shall do this. Guillaume D, or you can pronounce Dye if you want, but French it's D-Y-E. He has also published many articles in English. He's a top-notch scholar, an international scholar.
Okay.
So it's very easy to find his work also in English. Just have a look at this academia page, and you will find lots of stuff.
Okay, you've heard this discussion, 10, 11 minutes, not very long. And yet it's absolutely damaging to the Standard Islamic Narrative. You see, the Standard Islamic Narrative believes wholeheartedly that the Quran is eternal, that the Quran has always existed, and could not come from the pen of any man, and certainly could not have had any antecedents to it prior to the 7th century. Because if that were the case, then that's an admission that the Quran is no longer eternal, no longer guarded by God, and that it can be changed and manipulated and even created by man himself. And that goes against everything that the Standard Islamic Narrative claims. It says so very clearly in chapter 85, verse 22. That's the eternality. In chapter 10, verse 15. In chapter 18, verse 27. It cannot be changed. Not by man, not by you, not by me, not by anybody. And then, of course, chapter 15, verse 9, where Allah himself guards it so it cannot be changed. Now here, this discussion we're having, we're showing that there are all kinds of antecedents. Those references that he has from D, and I mispronounced it, and he corrected me on that. Guillaume D, were very clear that much of the Quran has been borrowed from many different sources. If it's even one story is borrowed from another source, and you know where that source is, that introduces a whole nother element, which is anathema to the Standard Islamic Narrative, because that introduces man-made, human-made interaction and also interjections. Shuts down any notion that this could be eternal, shuts down any notion that this is unfettered by human hands, and shuts down any notion that it even came from Muhammad in the 7th century. All of these references that we were talking about, the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah, 2nd century, the Mishnah of Rabbah, 2nd century, the Bar Sanhedrin, 5th century. These are all much earlier than the Quran, because the Quran is supposedly 7th century, as we're now proving. It is more likely 8th, 9th, and 10th century, and maybe even later, since we don't even have the first copy that we can look at. Close to it, but not the first copy that is complete. So can you see why this is so damaging, and why, though it was just an aside by Odon and myself, we're really thinking through about using it. I thought it was good to do that, because this is not the only material that has been borrowed, these Jewish apocryphal writings. There has been much more material that has been borrowed, and we'll be getting into that. This book that we've already introduced, the Syriac Aramaic reading of the Quran, these are lectionaries, and I am going to be introducing this with another researcher coming out of Germany. His name is Thomas Alexander. Thomas Alexander will be coming on board in about a week, maybe in 2 weeks. There's so many videos that I've got to go through. But he will be unpacking this book, and this is proving to be one of the most damaging books, because this shows that much of the Quran has been borrowed from Christian lectionaries' sermons. Odon has been referring to that, has he not? And then the other one that is probably as damaging or more damaging is Gunther Lulling's, and this book, it's bright yellow. I don't like the color, but nonetheless I didn't choose it. A Challenge to Islam for Reformation. We'll be unpacking this, because this is his doctoral thesis. He scored higher than anybody else in his university, so high that he should have been given an automatic professorship, which he was not, because of what this has to say about the Quran. Lots of material yet for us to introduce on this channel. Can you see how exciting this is, though? Because all we're doing is looking and unpacking and asking the very questions that the Muslims should have been asking for centuries. Where did this book, the Quran, come from? Where do they get this from? Where did these words come from? Where did they all come from? I've got a whole slew of them up here. I just chose the first one, and this is Qalun's, written in 835. So where did Qalun get his material from? Where did Hafs get his material from? Where did any of these get us? Where did they get their material from? Well, we're finding out. A lot of it is borrowed. Yes, pilfered out of existing texts. Arabic, for sure, to be sure. That was Arabic, because it was all written in Arabic in the 7th. And I'm saying now, it is written in the 7th, not the Quran itself, but the material from which it was pilfered, the material from which it was borrowed, were written in the 7th, maybe even written in the 6th and 5th, because certainly the radiocarbon datings of the Sanaa manuscript go all the way back to 393. That's the 4th century. Isn't this exciting? As we unpack and pull back layer after layer after layer of the Quran, we're finding that we're getting back to the source of the Quran. And it is not pretty for Muslims. It's not pretty for Islam. And even for the Western academics who don't want you to know this. More of that later. God bless you. Just thought I'd put this up as a quick little ditty as an appendix to what we were just talking about with Odon. It's been great having Odon, and now we'll be moving over to Thomas soon. But come with us. talk about what we're talking about, and also come up with, not only if you have difficulties, not just objections, but also if you find other areas that we've missed or articles that we should be reading. Talk about it here in the comment. This is Jay, over and out.